Walls of Destiny. Part 2. Beyond the Walls. Chapter 10. Alone again. Mylo awoke to the soft, cheerful melodies of birds greeting the morning sun. The air felt fresh, crisp with the promise of a new day. He stretched, a quiet sense of renewal flooding through him. For the first time in days, he felt a flicker of hope. Rising, he dressed quickly, the weight of his journey ahead settling over him with each movement. He descended the stairs into the tavern, where he found Jaskreed and Lorne seated at a small table, sipping tea and engaged in quiet conversation. They looked up as he entered, exchanging friendly nods. Mylo smiled and ordered a cup of tea, then stepped outside, the cool air greeting him like an old friend. The north stretched before him, a landscape of possibility, but also of unknowns. Mylo's thoughts turned inward. He hadn't heard Jack's voice in weeks, and he wondered what could have possibly happened, if he would ever see his Enoy again. He went over in his mind all that had happened to him after Burdoc left Encad and began to rehearse what he might tell Burdoc about why he fled the fortress and about the witch and Jack. Finishing his tea, Mylo counted the small amount of money left in his purse, 27 cedros and a single silver coin. It wasn't enough, not nearly. The reality of his situation hit him hard. He would have to part with some of his belongings, something he'd hoped to avoid. With a sigh, he gathered what he could spare, some spare clothes, a few trinkets, and stuffed them into a bag. He left the inn and walked to the pawn shop, hoping for some quick relief. But when he reached the door, it was locked, and a sign hung on the window, "On vacation all week." Frustration bubbled up within him. What now? He muttered, as he slumped down on the steps and tried to think of some other way he might acquire the money he needed. Just then, a young woman walked by, noticing his dejected posture. She paused, concern in her eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said kindly. "Were you looking to trade some things here?" Mylo looked up, a hint of hope stirring. "Yes, I was hoping to sell a few items, but the shop is closed." The woman's face brightened. "Right across the street, there's a jeweler who might be able to help. He usually only deals in jewelry, but with all the tourists passing through, he's been making exceptions." Mylo felt a rush of relief. "Thank you," he said, his voice laced with gratitude. He grabbed his bag and hurried across the street. The jewelry shop was small and unassuming, with a faint smell of polish and metal in the air. Inside, an older man, short and hunched, was polishing something in a delicate vise. His monocle glinted as he looked up from his work. "How can I help you?" he asked, flipping up the lens of his monocle with a practiced motion. "Well, I was hoping to sell a few things," Mylo began, a little sheepish. "The pawn shop is closed." "Let's see what you have," the man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. He gestured to the counter, where Mylo began laying out his items, a buckler, a chainmail helmet, some spare trinkets, and a few odds and ends. "I'd like to get at least 50 for the set," Mylo said, pointing at the armor. The jeweler examined the buckler, then shook his head. "I'm afraid these won't fetch much. I can't keep inventory like this lying around. Maybe you'll have better luck next week when the other merchant returns." Mylo's heart sank. "I'm only passing through," he explained, the urgency in his voice rising. "I really need to get some money before I move on." The jeweler raised an eyebrow. "Surely you have something else of value." Mylo dug through his remaining items, feeling the jeweler's disinterest growing. The man was unimpressed by his spare trinkets and worn possessions. Desperate, Mylo rummaged through his pockets. All he had was the beads and a few marbles for his slingshot and a pocket knife which he began to stuff back into his pocket when the jeweler's sharp gaze caught sight of the beads. "Those beads," the jeweler said, his voice suddenly softer, almost intrigued. "May I see them?" Mylo stiffened, instinctively clutching the beads. I can't sell them," he said quickly. "They were a gift," said Mylo, reluctantly handing over the beads. The jeweler leaned forward and carefully took the item, his eyes glinting behind his monocle. "Oh, but everything is for sale, at the right price, my friend." After a brief examination he continued, "These appear to be very special indeed." Mylo frowned, torn. "They aren't for sale. I'm sorry." The jeweler held them up to the light, inspecting them carefully. But you misunderstand. These could be worth more than you know. Just a moment, please." He disappeared into the back room, returning with a small vial of black powder. He held the vial up to the beads and waited for a brief moment. He nodded, a satisfied grin spreading across his face. "These beads are made from a mineral that's incredibly rare. I can offer you 150 cedros for them." Mylo's pulse quickened, but he shook his head. "I really shouldn't." The jeweler's expression hardened. "I'll pay you 170 cedros." 170? "All I need is enough to pay for the ferry." "What about this ring?" "Surely it must," began Mylo. 210 for both items. "That is my final offer," said the man sharply. Mylo considered it. He could use the money. Burdoc would understand. Besides, he might not need the beads now that he would be traveling in the safety of his new friends. "All right," Mylo said, his voice steady. "You have a deal." After completing the transaction, Mylo headed straight for the grocer. He didn't want to accept handouts from Lorne or Jaskreed if he could avoid it. Their kindness in offering to help him reach the gathering was more than enough. He was determined to manage on his own. At the market, Mylo carefully chose his supplies: 2 pounds of dried meat, a pound of nuts, a few loaves of flatbread, twine, a map, and a few other essentials. Once he had everything, he returned to his room to store the provisions. Then, with an unsettled sense of anticipation, he decided to go on a short walk through the western side of town, perhaps to clear his head or gather his thoughts before the journey. The path led him into a dry, dusty area, and Mylo's eyes drifted westward. He could feel the wastelands looming not far beyond the town's borders. He turned back, deciding not to venture too far, and chose a trail that curved southward, following the outer perimeter of the town. The trail eventually intersected with another that led directly south. As he walked toward the southern edge of the town, he caught sight of a horse-drawn carriage approaching, the wheels kicking up dust behind it. A man and a woman were riding in the carriage, and as they drew near, the man's eyes locked onto Mylo. He had the appearance of someone just past middle age, rough, but not unkind. His beard was neatly trimmed, and his gaze was sharp. The woman beside him had short brown hair and appeared much younger than her companion. The man's piercing eyes never left Mylo as the carriage slowed. He stepped down from the vehicle without breaking eye contact. "You," he barked. "You bring evil to this town, young man." Mylo stood frozen, caught off guard by the harsh words. "What?" he stammered, utterly confused. The woman beside him, alarmed, turned to the man. "Anaras, stop," she implored, but the man was undeterred. "Why are you here?" Anaras demanded, his voice firm and unwavering. Mylo's heart pounded. He was at a loss for words, unable to comprehend what was happening. "Anaras," the woman called again, her voice softer this time, almost pleading. Anaras paused, his gaze still locked on Mylo, but then he sighed in frustration and climbed back into the carriage. As the horses began to pull away, he turned toward Mylo and muttered, "Evil seeks you. I can see it all around you. Mercy be to your soul." The words echoed in Mylo's ears as the carriage slowly creaked past. Mylo stood rooted to the spot, still frozen in disbelief. The passers-by began to stare at him, their curious eyes heavy with unspoken judgment. His face flushed with embarrassment. Was this some sort of local superstition? Was Anaras a wizard? Did he know about the witch? The thought gnawed at him. Trying to shake off the unsettling encounter, Mylo walked back toward the center of town, keeping his pace measured and calm, though his mind raced. He stayed far enough back to avoid drawing the attention of Anaras, who, from the carriage, periodically glanced over his shoulder toward Mylo. By the time he returned to the inn, Mylo was feeling the weight of the encounter pressing on him. He needed to center himself. His stomach growled with hunger, and he quickly retreated to his room, where he made a simple sandwich with the food he had purchased. Once it was ready, he went out onto the balcony overlooking the inn's backyard. Beyond the pool and the well, he spotted a small dirt path leading into a field overgrown with tall grass, begging for a proper haying. He imagined Jack running and playing in the field, munching on the lush greenery. As he was reminiscing, he noticed Lorne, Jaskreed, another man, and a woman exit the inn. They all sat together at one of the picnic tables. Mylo quickly backed away and out of sight. They were just too far away to hear them, but he suspected they were talking about the wizard gathering. He was sure the man and woman were the same ones who rode past him on the southern road. He must be a wizard, thought Mylo. What was his name? Anaras? That's not a wizard name, it is Cedranavian. But in these times, it might be safer not to advertise the fact that you are a wizard. Mylo was certain he heard someone say, "Tomorrow at dawn," at the end of their conversation. There was no doubt they were some of the folks that Lorne and Jaskreed were waiting for. "What will I do?" he thought. "This, Anaras, wizard or not, will never allow me to go with them to the gathering. He is convinced that there is some sort of evil around me." His heart was filled with sorrow, but he knew he still had to somehow go to the gathering. "I'll follow them," he decided, his resolve firming. He had learned a few tricks about tracking from Losgrel during their time together, and he hoped that would be enough. His mind lingered for a moment on the beads. He regretted selling them, but the jeweler had been clear: all transactions are final. Still, he hoped his tracks would blend in with those of the others heading north. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mental preparation. Mylo even found himself praying to the Norn for the first time in years. He whispered a quiet prayer, asking for strength, courage, and luck as the road ahead grew darker with uncertainty. That night, despite his restless thoughts, he managed a decent sleep. He woke just before dawn as planned, his body still groggy, but his determination intact. He quickly checked his room one last time, ensuring nothing was left behind, then grabbed his pack and made his way to the rendezvous point and hid behind an old tool shed nearby. Within minutes, the sound of footsteps and voices drifted to him. Jaskreed, Lorne, Anaras, and a few others, people he didn't recognize, came into view. The group was larger than he had anticipated, and the more people there were, the easier they would be to track. They had horses, but for the purpose of hauling gear and provisions, not for riding, which would work in his favor. It was clear they were waiting for Mylo. The band didn't linger long, preferring to leave the town before sunrise, keeping their movements hidden from curious eyes. They took a seldom-used path heading north, and Mylo waited until they were out of sight before following. A chill clung to the air, and a light breeze stirred the trees. Mylo breathed deeply, steeling himself for the long journey ahead, then set off. He paced himself, just out of sight, but close enough to hear their distant footsteps. They traveled for miles before stopping. The nights were lengthening and growing colder, and Mylo knew that soon, his tent and sleeping bag wouldn't be enough. That night, he saw the smoke from their fire on the horizon and felt the warmth in his bones, but he couldn't risk building his own. They would notice the glow and that they were being followed. Wolves howled in the distance, and other creatures, too, made their presence known. Mylo barely slept, the cold and the sounds of the wild keeping him restless. By morning, the travelers had moved on. Mylo folded up his tent and followed. When he came to their old camp, the fire had burned down to embers. He warmed his hands, drank from his flask, and moved on, picking up their trail again. The hours blurred into one another. They rested again for food, and Mylo did the same. Once more, they marched on until dusk, then stopped for the night. Exhausted and cold, Mylo curled up in his blanket, the distant sounds of wolves and unknown creatures filling the dark. He slept fitfully, haunted by the endless howl of the wild. As the days passed, the cold grew harsher, and Mylo was forced to increase the distance between himself and the travelers so that he too could have a fire by night to keep from freezing. Lorne had said it would take 5 days at most, but was it the 5th day already? Or the 6th? Mylo couldn't remember. Was he still tracking the right people? Was the witch leading him astray somehow? It seemed his mind was beginning to play tricks on him. Whichever day it was, it became clear that he had lost their trail. He could find no trace of the party whatsoever, and he wasn't sure how far the shore was or where exactly the ferry would launch from. He began to despair. Though he thought he had been rationing his food, he was beginning to run out, and the rest of the flatbread had gotten moldy, so he had to get rid of it by burning it so as not to attract animals. Why didn't I flee to River's Edge? He thought bitterly. I could be sitting by a warm fire reading a book if I'd left when I had the chance. Lonely and isolated, Mylo stared up at the stars, regretting his decisions. His prayer for guidance was interrupted by a rustling in the distance. The wolves were closing in, and other creatures, he couldn't say what, were nearby. Mylo clutched his sword tightly, but sleep found him eventually, though fitful and uncertain. The next morning, a thin layer of snow covered the ground. Mylo brushed it off and rekindled the fire, not particularly concerned about the late hour. He had lost the trail anyway. His food supply was dwindling. He had only dried berries and nuts left. He checked a trap he'd set the night before and caught a small rabbit. Not much meat, but it would do. He cooked it and ate quickly before packing up and heading north again. Soon, he found himself at the edge of a dense forest. The trees stood like a massive wall before him. Then something caught his eye, off to the right, a clearing. He walked toward it and saw a path. Maybe it's the one they took, he thought. But there were no tracks, only the faint outline of a route leading north. According to the map, the forest wouldn't take long to cross, and beyond it lay the lake. He decided to follow it. He rested occasionally, nibbling on his dwindling supplies. The moons rose, casting silver light across the forest, renewing his energy. He fashioned a torch from a suitable branch and a quantity of oil he'd purchased in the village. It offered a bit of light and hopefully some protection from predators. If I just keep walking, I could reach the ferry by morning. Then I'll rest. He began to hear strange movements far behind him. Then a laugh, eerie and hollow, echoed through the forest. It must be an animal, he thought. It sent chills down his spine. About 10 minutes later, there it was again. It was It was much closer this time. This was no animal. He quickened his pace. He wondered if he should put out the torch so it couldn't follow him, but what if it were the only thing keeping whatever it was from attacking him? The trail glowed in the moonlight, and eyes on each side of the trail continuously blinked on and off as if watching Mylo and his dilemma. Once again, the hair-raising cackle echoed in the night. Panic began to take him as his heart quickened. It is most certainly the witch and her henchmen, he thought. He was now walking at the fastest pace he could, and he was growing weary from hunger. Suddenly right behind he heard, snap, followed by the rustling of leaves or brush. His adrenaline surged, and he broke out into a run, fearing for his life. After what felt like an hour, he began to slow and stumble and gasp for air. He made every effort to keep moving, and soon the dawn was beginning to spread across the land. It was light enough now to see who or what it was behind him. He turned around but saw no one. He could barely hold onto the torch, and he didn't need it anymore, and he tossed it into the nearest stream. The path narrowed and seemed to follow the crest of a hill. To the right it dropped off by 25 feet. He felt vulnerable, like he could be seen from all sides now. He wanted nothing more than to lie down, but the fear of death pushed him onward. The sweat was now beginning to chill him. He began to shiver. There he was, cold, tired, hungry, and being pursued by an evil witch who wanted to kill him. He dared not lie down for fear that he wouldn't get back up. If the witch didn't get him, he thought, then the elements would. He spotted a long stick and used it to help him take some of the weight off his legs, though he had lost considerable weight from rationing his food and a tremendous amount of walking. He knew there was no turning back. Once again, he heard the laughter.